The voice echoes through empty hallways at 4 a.m. Al Pacino stands alone in his Manhattan penthouse, delivering lines to his reflection with earth-shattering volume. His neighbors stopped complaining years ago. They've learned that silence for Al Pacino isn't peaceful, it's terrifying. What they don't know is that this nightly ritual isn't practice, it's survival, because the moment Al Pacino stops shouting, he disappears completely. New York, 1983. Al Pacino had just finished Scarface, and something had fundamentally broken inside his vocal cords, not physically, but psychologically. Friends noticed he couldn't speak at normal volume anymore. Every conversation became a performance. Every sentence demanded theatrical projection. Waiters would step back when he ordered coffee. Taxi drivers would turn down their radios. The man who'd whispered his way through early theater roles had become addicted to his own volume. But this wasn't about ego or attention. This was about something much more disturbing. The phone rings in his apartment, but even his hello booms through the receiver like he's addressing a stadium. The caller, his longtime friend from acting school, immediately asks if everything's okay. Pacino doesn't understand the question. To him, this is normal volume. To everyone else, it sounds like someone screaming for help. But what his friend didn't realize was that Pacino had already been screaming for help for years. His voice coach from the 1960s remembers a different Al Pacino entirely. He was almost inaudible. She recalls in a rare interview years later, "I had to lean in just to hear him breathe. We spent months trying to get him to project past the second row. He would practice projection exercises, but the moment class ended, he'd return to whispers. It was like he was afraid of taking up sonic space in the world." That Pacino spoke in whispers, moved like a shadow, and seemed to apologize for taking up space in any room. His early acting partners remember having to strain to hear his lines during rehearsals. Directors would constantly ask him to speak up during auditions. For years, his career stagnated because casting directors couldn't hear him from the back of small theaters. So what happened to that quiet boy from the Bronx? What turned whispers into roars? The answer lies in a childhood trauma that Al Pacino has never fully addressed publicly. The day his voice was stolen from him. Bronx, 1946. 7-year-old Alfredo Pacino sits in the back of his second-grade classroom, hand raised to answer a question about arithmetic. When the teacher calls on him, he speaks in his natural voice, soft, thoughtful, almost musical. The class erupts in laughter. "Speak up, mouse boy." Someone shouts from the front row. Other kids join in. What did the mouse say? Did someone hear squeaking? The teacher, instead of defending him, asks him to project like a real actor would, and then moves on to another student. The humiliation burns into his memory like acid. For the rest of the day, he doesn't speak at all. During lunch, kids imitate his soft voice, making exaggerated whispers and giggling. He eats alone, planning never to speak again. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was going home to his mother's apartment, where she was entertaining guests from the neighborhood. When he tried to tell her about his day, she shushed him impatiently. "Not now, Al. The adults are talking." He spent the rest of the evening invisible, unheard, forgotten. He went to bed that night convinced that his natural voice was worthless. That night, 7-year-old Al Pacino made a promise to himself that would eventually destroy the man he'd become. From that moment forward, volume became survival. In high school, he discovered that speaking loudly got him noticed by teachers. In acting class, projection earned him praise from instructors who'd previously ignored him. On stage, commanding presence meant commanding respect. Somewhere along the way, the volume stopped being a choice and became a compulsion. Every quiet moment felt like a return to that helpless 7-year-old being laughed at by his classmates. But here's what nobody understood. Pacino wasn't trying to be heard by audiences. He was still trying to be heard by that second-grade classroom that laughed at his whispers. The volume escalated through the 1970s, like an addiction spiraling out of control. During Godfather rehearsals, Francis Ford Coppola had to constantly remind him to bring it down. Marlon Brando, famous for his own intensity, pulled Pacino aside after one particularly loud scene rehearsal. "Kid," Brando said, "save some voice for the actual take." But Pacino couldn't control it anymore. Even casual conversations between scenes boomed across the set. By Serpico, his co-stars were asking for separate trailers because his line delivery during breaks was exhausting. During script readings, other actors would wince when it was his turn to speak. The energy was relentless, overwhelming. During Scarface, crew members started wearing headphones between takes just to escape the constant vocal assault. The addiction was becoming unmanageable for everyone around him. But still, the volume kept escalating. His relationships suffered catastrophically. Women would tell him they felt like they were being yelled at during intimate conversations. Even when he said, "I love you," it sounded like he was declaring war. One ex-girlfriend recalled in a magazine interview years later. "I'd ask him to whisper sweet nothings, and he'd boom sweet everythings. It was like being romanced by a foghorn." Friends started making excuses to avoid dinner plans. Eating with Al became like dining inside a stadium announcer booth, one longtime friend admitted. "You'd leave the restaurant with a headache and ringing ears." Phone calls became dreaded events. "You'd have to hold the receiver 6 inches from your ear," his agent remembered. Even then, neighbors could hear both sides of the conversation. The man famous for his passionate performances had become impossible to be around quietly. But Pacino couldn't understand why everyone seemed so uncomfortable. To him, this was normal communication. This was how people who mattered spoke. Quiet voices belonged to people who didn't deserve attention. He'd proven that decades ago in that classroom. Then came the night that changed everything. Or should have. January 1984. Pacino is having dinner at an upscale Manhattan restaurant with Arthur Hiller, a theater director who'd known him since his struggling actor days in the late 1960s. They're discussing a potential Broadway revival, and Pacino is enthusiastically describing his vision for the character. Mid-sentence, during what he considers a normal conversation about artistic choices, Hiller suddenly stops speaking and stares at him with genuine concern. "Oh," he says quietly, "do you realize you're shouting?" Pacino looks around the restaurant for the first time since they'd sat down. Every table has turned to stare at them. Conversations have stopped entirely. A child is crying at a nearby table, startled by his volume during a discussion about Tennessee Williams. The maitre d' is approaching their table with obvious discomfort, followed by a concerned-looking manager. Other diners are pointing discreetly and whispering among themselves. "I'm not shouting," Pacino responds. But the words come out like a battle cry echoing through the silent restaurant. A woman at a corner table actually covers her ears. In that moment, Al Pacino experienced something terrifying. He realized he had completely lost control of his own voice. The director leans forward and whispers, so quietly that Pacino has to strain to hear him. "Al, I can barely hear myself think. You're talking like you're performing Lear for the back row, but we're just having dinner." For the first time in decades, Pacino tries to whisper back, but when he attempts to lower his volume, something horrifying happens. He can barely produce sound at all. His vocal cords have forgotten how to operate at normal levels. The whisper comes out as a hoarse rasp, then disappears entirely into silence. He tries again, forcing air through his throat, but produces only a grinding sound that's somehow more disturbing than his shouting. He literally cannot communicate quietly anymore. The silence that follows reveals the truth that has been building for 40 years. Al Pacino is not shouting because he wants to. He's shouting because he's forgotten how to exist at any other volume. They leave the restaurant without finishing their meal. The walk back to Pacino's apartment is conducted in complete silence. Not by choice, but because he cannot figure out how to speak at a volume appropriate for sidewalk conversation. Every attempt comes out either as a boom that echoes off buildings or as nothing audible at all. That night, alone in his apartment, Pacino spent 3 hours standing in front of his bathroom mirror, trying to say hello at a normal volume. He couldn't do it. Every attempt came out either as a theatrical projection or as complete silence. There was no middle ground left. The quiet boy from the Bronx was completely gone, replaced by someone who could only exist at maximum intensity. He called his voice coach from the 1960s. The woman who remembered his whispers. When she answered the phone, he boomed, "It's Al Pacino," so loudly that she immediately asked if he was calling from a construction site. "I need help," he shouted, and then tried to explain his problem, but every word thundered through the phone lines like he was addressing a rally. "Oh," she said gently, "I can't understand what you're saying because you're screaming." The answer was no. He could not speak quietly. The mechanism was broken. But the psychological damage was already irreversible. In the months that followed, Pacino tried everything. Voice therapy sessions where he practiced humming at low volumes. Meditation classes where he attempted to find inner silence. Hypnosis sessions designed to return him to his childhood voice. Nothing worked. His vocal cords had become addicted to tension. His psyche addicted to the safety that volume provided. Speaking quietly felt like drowning in vulnerability. Whispering felt like returning to that powerless 7-year-old who could be ignored and dismissed. The cruel irony became apparent to everyone around him. The voice that had made him famous had also made him unreachable. He could command stadiums but couldn't have a quiet conversation with a lover. He could deliver monologues that moved audiences to tears, but couldn't say good morning to his doorman without it sounding like a public announcement that echoed through the lobby. His therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, was one of the few people who refused to be intimidated by his volume. During their first session, when he boomed his way through childhood memories, she calmly said, "Mr. Pacino, I need you to understand something. I can hear you perfectly at half that volume." When he tried to comply and couldn't, she diagnosed the problem immediately. "The volume isn't really about being heard," she explained during one session, speaking in a deliberately soft voice that forced him to strain to listen. "It's about protecting yourself from the vulnerability of silence. When you're shouting, you can't hear anyone else's judgment. You can't hear your own doubt. You can't hear the criticism that 7-year-old boy is still afraid of receiving." But understanding the problem didn't solve it. If anything, it made the situation worse, because now he was consciously aware of how trapped he'd become. Friends started avoiding him altogether, unable to endure the constant vocal assault. Business meetings became uncomfortable endurance tests, where studio executives would quietly ask assistants to bring aspirin for the headaches that inevitably followed. Even his own family began limiting their time with him. Phone calls with his mother became 5-minute affairs because longer conversations left her exhausted. Restaurant owners started recognizing him and suggesting quieter tables in back rooms, away from other diners. Theater colleagues stopped inviting him to intimate gatherings. The volume that was supposed to ensure he was never ignored again had instead guaranteed that he would be increasingly isolated. And still, he couldn't stop. The saddest part wasn't that Al Pacino couldn't stop shouting. It was that he couldn't stop, because stopping meant returning to that 7-year-old boy who was told his natural voice wasn't worth hearing. Every whisper felt like surrender. Every quiet moment felt like disappearing back into invisibility. During interviews, journalists would often comment on his passionate delivery and intense energy, not realizing they were witnessing someone trapped in a vocal prison of his own making. He'd learned to frame his condition as artistic choice, as the mark of a committed performer, but privately he knew the truth. Today, Al Pacino still shouts, in interviews where his voice carries across entire rooms, on film sets where his off-camera conversations compete with heavy machinery, at dinner parties where other guests develop headaches, and in empty apartments at 4 a.m., where he practices being heard by people who aren't there. Not because he wants attention, but because silence has become synonymous with disappearing. His voice fills every space he enters, but the man behind that voice grows quieter and more isolated each year. The 7-year-old boy, who was laughed at for whispering, never learned that there was a space between silence and shouting where real connection happens. And this is the tragic truth about Al Pacino's volume. It was never about being heard. It was about never having to listen to the silence that confirmed his worst fear, that maybe that little boy's whisper really wasn't worth hearing after all. The boy who was told to speak up never learned how to speak down, and now the volume that saved him has become the prison that holds him. Al Pacino learned to shout so loud that everyone would listen, but forgot how to speak so quietly that anyone could love him.